The brand on a horse one of them was riding. It's no mistaking the Ponderosa brand, sir.
Ponderosa. Are you sure you were on Concho land when it happened?
Oh, yes, sir. By a long ways, Mr. Bishop.
Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
The Federal Reserve Chairman is not just one of the most important economic policymakers in America. He or she is one of the most important policymakers in the world.
What about the $1 trillion plus in expansion of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet since last September? Have you conducted any investigations regarding that?
I think the Fed is out of control. I think what they're doing is wrong.
Your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today. The effect of this action, in other words, will be to stabilize the dollar. Now, this action will not win us any friends among the international money traders. But our primary concern is with the American workers and with fair competition around the world.
And you don't think that the U.S. government can turn this around?
It's not possible. Government can never help anything.
With a new currency, and it's going to be a world currency, it's going to be special drawing rights under the IMF.
It is a big idea, a new world order, where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause to achieve the universal aspirations of mankind: peace and security, freedom, and the rule of law. We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
In 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich summoned New York's most powerful bankers to an island off the coast of Georgia to secretly negotiate plans for an American central bank. Traveling under false names in a private railroad car, the great secrecy of this expedition would foster conspiracy theories for decades to come.
The Federal Reserve is not actually a lending operation. It's a fiat printing press. It is an illegal monopoly on the power to counterfeit fiat paper as US dollars. It is an unconstitutional and therefore illegal monopoly on the power to counterfeit money into existence. A power that has of course been unconstitutionally granted to the bank's owners by the traders in Congress. The reason this is all true is because the bank does not possess the money that it lends, but simply counterfeits it out of thin air. Tell me, how do you lend to others that which you do not actually possess yourself to lend?
The Federal Reserve has the power to create money. If you or I run the printing press in our basement, we're counterfeiters. When the Federal Reserve runs the printing press, the electronic printing press, it's monetary policy.
Here's the thing about the Federal Reserve. It's not federal, and there is no reserve. Every dollar in existence is owed to someone else, and not only that, but all the money in circulation is owed back to the Fed with interest. The problem with that is the money to pay the interest doesn't exist. It's never been created. This means that the Federal Reserve System is not only designed to keep us down, but also to keep us going down.
Bonanza will be shown after a special report from NBC News.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
For the first time in history, the dollar was just a piece of paper, backed only by faith in the Federal Reserve and its policies. Over the next decade, the cost of living more than doubled, as the dollar lost more than half its value.
So, what's going on here? Why does the Constitution clearly state that our money shall be coined, yet we are using government-issued, supposedly official paper dollar bills? And we can't even redeem these for silver any longer. And why does Thomas Jefferson, the very man who drafted the Declaration of Independence and co-authored the U.S. Constitution, warn us about banks and corporations? Something is off here.
The notion of a central bank does not fit into the Constitution. The Congress has the authority to coin money, and only gold and silver should be legal tender. And this is an absolute contradiction of the Constitution to have a Federal Reserve System and a central bank.
Leopold and Nathaniel Rothschild became the next generation of godfathers to take charge of the family fortune. They were like the Parker brothers of Monopoly, and they played the game like they invented it. The brothers were the world champions, and that's because they knew the secret to winning. The secret to winning was to cheat, and the best way to cheat was to become the banker and rewrite the rules. So that's exactly what they did. Since the U.S. Congress was already in charge of the rules in the Federal Reserve Bank, winning the U.S. version of Monopoly meant they would have to outsmart Congress. So they sent Jacob Schiff, their trusted lifelong friend and neighbor from Frankfurt, Germany, to New York City, and they put him in charge of their friend company called Kuhn and Loeb. Then they ganged up with other big players by investing in Rockefeller Oil, Harriman Railroads, Carnegie Steel, and Brown Brothers Investment Banking. By 1901, the Rothschilds had amassed $22.2 billion in U.S. assets. The mayor of New York, John Hyland, called them the invisible government, while Congressman Louis McFadden called them a dark crew of financial pirates who would slit a man's throat to get a dollar.
The Federal Reserve is a hybrid organization. It's a partnership between the federal government and the private banks. When you look at it deeper than that, its essence is neither as a government agency or a private company. In reality, it is a cartel. In other words, it's no different in essence than a banana cartel or a sugar cartel or an oil cartel. It's a grouping of the large private corporations in the field, banking, who have come together to create agreement between themselves to limit competition, to preserve their profits, and to make sure that no newcomers come in and take away their position. That's what cartels are always designed to do. And it's a shocking thing to realize that something as prestigious as the Federal Reserve System, at its core, is nothing more or less than a banking cartel with exactly those same objectives.
We have a system, the Federal Reserve System, that has all of these constitutional problems, and everyone is essentially looking in the opposite direction. So that doesn't square with the oath of office. And one would think that the president, being the head of the executive department, in which we find the Treasury, Department of Treasury, right, which interacts quite closely with the Federal Reserve, might have something direct to say about that. And then, of course, the president has a specific constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, and the supreme law of the land is the Constitution. So you would expect, on top of all of this, that he would be saying, wait a minute, if the Constitution doesn't square with the Federal Reserve Act in one or more ways, then I should be giving directives to the Secretary of the Treasury to take certain kinds of action to deal with that. And, of course, we see exactly the opposite.
I don't think it's good policy for the president or a president-elect to second-guess the Fed, which is an independent body.
And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
What should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
What the relationships are don't frankly matter. The Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take.
It was in 1908 that Schiff decided the time had come for his seizure of our money system. His chief lieutenants in that seizure were Colonel Edward Mandel House, whose entire career was that of chief executive and courier for Schiff, as I shall show, Bernard Baruch, and Herbert Lehman. In the fall of that year, they assembled in secret conclave at the Jekyll Island Hunt Club, owned by J.P. Morgan at Jekyll Island, Georgia. Among those present were J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Colonel House, Senator Nelson Aldrich, Schiff, Stillman and Vanderlip of the New York National City Bank, W. and J. Seligman, Eugene Meyer, Bernard Baruch, Herbert Lehman, Paul Warburg, in short, all of the international bankers in America, all of them members of the hierarchy of the Illuminati's great conspiracy. A week later, they emerged with what they called the Federal Reserve System. Senator Aldrich was the stooge who was to railroad it through Congress. But they held that railroading in abeyance for one chief reason. They would first have to plant their man, an obedient stooge, in the White House to sign the Federal Reserve Act into law. They knew that even if the Senate would pass that act unanimously, the then newly elected President Taft would promptly veto it. So they waited. In 1912, their man, Woodrow Wilson, was elected to the presidency. Immediately after Wilson was inaugurated, Senator Aldrich railroaded the Federal Reserve Act through both houses of Congress, and Wilson promptly signed it, and the Federal Reserve Act became law. That heinous act of treason was committed in December 23, 1913, 2 days before Christmas, when all the members of Congress, except for several carefully picked representatives and 3 equally carefully picked senators, were away from Washington.
On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, triggering our entry into that war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared the attack was a day that will live in infamy. A day of infamy indeed, but not because of the alleged surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. After 60 years of surfacing information, it is clear that not only was the attack on Pearl Harbor known weeks in advance, it was outright wanted and provoked. Roosevelt, whose family had been New York bankers since the 18th century, whose uncle Frederick was on the original Federal Reserve Board, was very sympathetic to the interests of the international bankers, and the interest was to enter the war, as we've seen, nothing is more profitable for international bankers than war. In a journal entry by Roosevelt's Secretary of War Henry Stimson, dated November 25, 1941, he documented a conversation he had with Roosevelt. The question was, how should we maneuver them into firing the first shot? It was desirable to make sure the Japanese be the ones to do this, so that there should remain no doubt as to who were the aggressors. In the months leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt had done almost everything in his power to anger the Japanese, showing a posture of aggression. He halted all of Japan's imports of American petroleum. He froze all the Japanese assets in the United States. He made public loans to nationalist China and supplied military aid to the British, both enemies of Japan in the war, which, by the way, is completely in violation of international war rules. 3 days before the attack, Australian intelligence told Roosevelt about a Japanese task force moving towards Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt ignored it. So, as hoped and allowed, on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, killing 2,400 soldiers. Before Pearl Harbor, 83% of the American public wanted nothing to do with the war. After Pearl Harbor, 1 million men volunteered for the war. It's important to note, Nazi Germany's war effort was largely supported by 2 organizations, one of which was called IG Farben. IG Farben produced 84% of Germany's explosives, and even the Zyklon B used in the concentration camps to kill millions. One of the unspoken partners of IG Farben was J.D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company in America. In fact, the German Air Force could not operate without a special additive patented by Rockefeller Standard Oil. The drastic bombing of London by Nazi Germany, for example, was made possible by a $20 million sale of fuel to IG Farben by the Rockefeller Standard Oil Company. This is just one small point on the topic of how American business funded both sides of World War II. One other treasonous organization worth mentioning is the Union Banking Corporation of New York City. Not only did it finance numerous aspects of Hitler's rise to power, along with actual materials during the war, it was also a Nazi money laundering bank, which was eventually exposed for having millions of dollars of Nazi money in its vaults. The Union Banking Corporation of New York was eventually seized for violations of the Trading with the Enemy Act. Guess who the director and vice president of the Union Bank was? Prescott Bush, our current president's grandfather, and of course our former president's father. Keep that in mind when considering the moral and political dispositions of the Bush family. Vietnam. The United States' official declaration of war on North Vietnam in 1964 came after an alleged incident involving 2 U.S. destroyers being attacked by North Vietnamese PT boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. This was known as the Gulf of Tonkin Incident. This single situation was the catalytic pretext for massive troop deployment and full-fledged warfare. One problem, however, the attack on the U.S. destroyers by Vietnamese PT boats never happened. It was a completely staged event to have an excuse to enter the war. Former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara stated years later that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was a mistake, while many other insiders and officers have come forward, relaying that it was a contrived farce, a complete lie. Once in the war, it was business as usual. In October 1966, President Lyndon Johnson lifted trading restrictions on the Soviet bloc, knowing full well that the Soviets were providing upwards of 80% of North Vietnam's war supplies. Consequently, Rockefeller interests financed factories in the Soviet Union, which the Soviets used to manufacture military equipment and send it to North Vietnam. However, the funding of both sides of this conflict was only one side of the coin. In 1985, Vietnam's rules of engagement were declassified. This detailed what American troops were and were not allowed to do in the war. It included absurdities like North Vietnamese anti-aircraft missile systems could not be bombed until they were known to be fully operational. No enemy could be pursued once they crossed the border of Laos or Cambodia. And most revealing of all, the most critical strategic targets were not allowed to be attacked unless initiated by high military officials. Apart from these imposed ludicrous limitations, North Vietnam was informed of these restrictions and therefore could base entire strategies around the limitations of the American forces. This is why the war went on so long. And the bottom line is this: the Vietnam War was never meant to be won, just sustained. This war for profit resulted in 58,000 American deaths and 3 million dead Vietnamese.
Third down.